Okay, so one of the things that computers are brilliant at is doing things repeatedly, doing things over and over again. I don't know about you, but if I have to do the same job 2 or 3 times, I get bored really quickly. Computers will never ever get bored. So how do we write these loops as part of our JavaScript programs? How do we make it do something again and again and again? So in this session, we're going to look at some very simple loops, and all we're going to be doing is kind of printing numbers out. But later on in the course, we'll use these loops to do repetitive tasks and to do something multiple times for us. So one of the the most basic ways of writing a loop is to use something called a while loop. And we're kind of saying, it's a little bit like in English, we're kind of saying, whilst something is true, do this. Whilst you're at the shops, look for some milk, for example. So the way that we make up a while loop is we use the while keyword, and then in here we need to put a condition. We need to say, run this while loop until this goes false, until something is false in here. So what we can do to get this conditional is up here, let's write ourselves a little variable, and we'll say let our counter equals 0. Don't worry too much if that doesn't seem to make sense at the moment. It will all become apparent. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, whilst our counter is less than 10, well, we want to go and do something. So you see, I've come out of those parentheses in our while loop, and I've added some curly brackets for our code block. So what do we want to do in this while loop? Well, one of the things that we want to do is we want to count up our counter every single time the while loop runs. And let's just also print out the counter's value to the console. So we can very simply just say counter plus plus, just to increment our counter variable. And then let's go ahead and console.log, and let's just put a little message in here. We'll say while loop and add a comma afterwards, and we'll just print out that, we'll log that counter to the console. Okay, so if I go to my index.html and open this with live server, bring over the document, and open the console. Okay, so what we've got here is we've said, okay, print out our counter, which is 1, because so we can see that we've actually printed out the numbers 1 to 10. It's done this repeatedly for us. It's done this 10 times for us. Now, something that might be a little bit odd is you'll see that we initialized our counter at 0, but we're getting 1 here. Well, remember, JavaScript executes from top to bottom. And what we're doing here is we're saying increment the counter by 1 and then log it out. If we wanted this to start at 0, we would need to be careful with the order in which we were writing our code. So let's just go ahead and move this down underneath that console.log. Okay, so if I save this now, you'll see that we then get it from 0. So we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because we're saying, hey, go and print our counter and then increment it once. And then we say, go to the beginning of your while loop again, check that this is true. And if it is true, we want to log out what the new value of counter is. And then we increment it again. And the whole process kind of repeats until this is false. So you can see that we got all the way to 9, and then we incremented it one more, which meant that this was now false. Our counter was equal to 10, so it was not less than 10, and it stopped running. Now, something that you do need to be very careful of with while loops is that you need to put in some way for this counter or this condition to become false. Now, some of you during this video will have jumped the gun and you'll have already found this out, but I'm going to demonstrate this for you now. So if I just remove this incrementing here, so what's going to happen is this will check that the counter is less than 10, which it is because it's 0, and then it will log out the counter. It will then go back up to the top and check whether this is true, which it will be because it will still be 0, and it will go on and on and on. So let's see what happens when I save this, and I'm going to very quickly save it and go over to my console to show you what happens. Okay, so we've got our while loop running lots and lots of times. You can see that it's actually, the HTML has kind of stopped running here. We've got just this loading here. And I don't know, my video might even be getting jittery because my computer's kind of filling its memory up, filling its memory with our while loop here. There is no way to stop this other than closing the page. And in fact, I can just hear that the fans in my computer have turned on as well. So let's close that before my computer completely stops working. It's just really important that you put a way for this condition to become false. Otherwise, you'll be caught in what's known as an infinite loop. So how do we stop that happening completely? Well, I'm just going to put in that counter ++ again so that this will become false. Let's just check that, and I'm going to have to reopen my live server to make sure. Brilliant, it does in fact stop when the counter is equal to 10. Great, so that's kind of a very common loop. Another very common loop that you will come across is the for loop. Now, the way that we write these, and there's no way to get stuck in an infinite loop, or well, I say that, there are ways that you can get stuck in an infinite loop with a for, but it's far more difficult to end up with an infinite loop. So the way that we can make a for loop is we say for, and then some parentheses. Now we need 3 parts for this for loop, and I'm just going to write them in a comment here. First of all, we need something called an initialization. So what this is kind of a variable that will update every time the loop runs, but we need to first initialize it and hand it to our for loop. So the easiest way to do this is to say let, so we're making a new variable, and then it's very common to use just a variable name of I. Now there's arguments everywhere, between people that say this I stands for iterator. Some people say it stands for index. I think it stands for iterator or iteration. But that's an argument that we can all have on Slack later on. So we need to initialize this I as something. So we'll say for this, just to make it kind of do the same thing as our while loop, we will initialize this as 0. Now, the next thing that we need in our for loop is a condition. So when something is true, we want to run the for loop again. When it's false, we want to stop the for loop. So what we can do in here is we can add a semicolon, and then we add our condition. So we'll say here, so kind of the way that I say it is I kind of say let I is 0, initialize I at 0, and then whilst I is something, we want to run the loop. So we'll say whilst I is less than 10, that's how we want to continue running our loop. And then afterwards, we need another semicolon because what we're going to add here is our iteration. And what happens here is we need to say kind of update our initialized variable with a new value. So what do we want to do every time this for loop runs? Well, in its most basic form, we just want to add 1 to I. So we'll say I plus plus. Now, outside of these parentheses, we can then add a code block to run every time this for loop runs. Now, this exact kind of way of doing it, this let I equal 0 and then having a condition in here and then I plus plus is a very common way that you'll see people writing for loops online. So let's just go ahead and say console.log and then put a little message for loop and comma, and then we'll just print I in our console. So if I save this now, brilliant, you'll see that we've got kind of exactly the same output as our for loop, as our while loop, sorry. We've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because we initialized I at 0, and we've added 1 to I every single time our for loop has run. And then we said, hey, only run our for loop if this condition is true. So I got to 10 and then it said, yep, I'm not going to run our loop anymore. So can you maybe kind of stop for a moment and have a look at some of the similarities and the differences between our while loop and our for loop? Well, first of all, the while loop will run and run and run until this goes false. But the for loop will run a specific number of times based on this condition. Yeah, they're quite similar, but they're also slightly different as well. What I would say is if you want something to run and you don't know how many times you want it to run, you just want it to run over and over again until something becomes false, you're probably looking for a while loop, because while something is true, you want to keep running it. But if you know how many times you want your loop to run, well, that's where you probably want your for loop to come in. What I find is that for loops are probably more commonly used because you've got this slight safety of it will never go into an infinite loop. But, that is a matter of opinion. There is just one last kind of loop that I want to show you. Now, these aren't really common, but they can be quite handy. And this is something called a do while. Now, let's just write one out. We'll have a look at the differences, and then we'll see how that is different in our console. So what I'm going to do is, and it's going to look very similar to our while loop with very kind of obvious difference as well. So we will first need a counter or an iterator to initialize. So we'll say let counter 2 equals 0. And then what we're going to do is we're going to write do something. Now in here, I'm going to say counter 2 plus plus because I want to increment counter 2. I don't want to go into an infinite loop. We do need to increment that counter. And then I'm just going to write console.log, and then we'll say, write a message of do while, and then we'll say print out counter 2. Okay, so that's all very well and good. You'll see that we've got an error here because it's kind of saying, hey, you've not actually finished off writing your do while loop. So, it's saying while is expected. Brilliant, that's quite helpful. So here I'm going to write while, and then we need this conditional. So what I'll do is here I'll say whilst our counter 2 is less than 10. So let's just save this now. And you'll see, oh, actually, let me just change this code ever so slightly so that we get what looks like the same output from both of them. So I'm just going to put that counter underneath here. So we're logging out our counter and then we're incrementing it the same way that we did with our while loop here. Okay, so if I save this now, it looks like exactly the same thing is happening. But there is a very subtle and very important difference between the while loop and the do while. And that is that in the while loop, it checks this first, and if it's true, it will then run the code block. On the other hand, in the do while loop, it will run this code block and then check if this is true. So we can prove that that's the case. If I change this to 11, for example, our counter for our while loop to 11, and I save this, you'll notice that our while loop never runs because it says, hey, I'm going to go and check whether the counter is less than 10. Oh, wait, it is not. So I won't run any of this code. Let's do the same thing with our do while now. So we'll say that counter 2 is 11. So if we save this now, you'll see that our do while loop did actually run, even though the condition evaluated as false. Because in the do while, it runs this code, and then it said, hey, is this conditional true? No, it is not, so I'm not going to run again. So this can be handy if you've got something that you need to say, go and get something from a database, regardless of a user's input. Even if something has not updated, you might still need to go and do that action. I will say that do while loops are much less common than while loops, but it's really important to know that they exist. So what I want you to take away from this lesson are some really kind of important points. We can use a while loop to run some code until a condition becomes false. It's super important to make sure that that condition does become false at some point. Otherwise, you will end up in an infinite loop. A for loop, on the other hand, kind of protects you from that infinite loop. And it's really good if you know that you need to do something a specific amount of times. The do while loop is a way of kind of using a while loop to make sure that your code block runs at least once. But in terms of commonality, you're more likely to see for loops, then likely to see while loops, and then you may see do while loops depending on the application that you need.